So the continent of Africa enters the year amid a convergence of unfortunate events. Multiple coups in the Sahel in mere months, conflict in the Horn of Africa region, fight for spheres of influence by both the West and East, as well as debt topping $1 trillion. Joining us for a look of how things may unfold over the course of the year is Professor Adekeye Adebajo, a senior research fellow at the University of Pretoria Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. Professor Adekeye, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. So in your opinion piece titled "Another Year of Staring Down the Barrel for Africa," you do not paint a pretty picture. Perhaps let's chop up this elephant and start in Central Africa with your outlook.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. I think one of the most important things we need to do as Africans is to be brutally honest with ourselves, and only then can we start to fix the problems. In terms of Central Africa, what I have looked at is the fact that the Democratic Republic of the Congo has had a conflict that's been going on for 2 decades now, and the east of the country, particularly the Kivus and Ituri, still remain volatile despite the fact that there is a state that's been declared, and over 3 million Congolese have been displaced in the 2 decades as a result of this conflict. In Central African Republic, something like 63% of the population, 3.1 million people, are expected to be in need of humanitarian assistance this year. And in Cameroon, if you look at Cameroon, the west of the country, the English-speaking part of the country, has been fighting what is turning out to be a civil war type situation, because they've been demanding autonomy for decades and not really got it. And the final issue that I identified in this area is that their political dynastic families, which are autocratic in countries like Gabon, Congo-Brazzaville, and Equatorial Guinea, in addition to Chad, which are trying to hang on to power as well. So that's my Central Africa prognosis.
Let's take a look at West Africa, what some have termed the coup belt of the continent. Your outlook?
Yes, the outlook in West Africa, unfortunately, is the fact that Nigeria, which accounts for 62% of the economy and should play the role of a regional leader or hegemon, is itself beset by conflicts, anarchy across the country, with the government unable to control that. And half of the 4.3 million displaced people in West Africa are actually in Nigeria itself. But the more worrying immediate concern is the fact that Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso have recently had military coups as a result of insecurity and poor governance. And I fear that countries like Guinea-Bissau and Niger, where coups have been attempted, as well as other fragile polities like Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, and Togo, could go the same way as dominoes.
A very interesting region of East Africa. You mention a country like Rwanda, for instance, Uganda and Tanzania, where we will continue to see the use of state instruments to suppress opposition.
Yes, I've mentioned those states because in those states you have dominant parties, and not only are they dominant, they use state instruments to suppress opposition to their rule, so making it very difficult for others to actually take power. And if we look at Kagame and Museveni, for example, they've been in power an inordinate amount of time, over 20 years in Rwanda, over 30 in Uganda. But what is also worrying on the Horn of Africa is that Ethiopia has been at war with the Tigray region. It's dragged in Eritrea as well. South Sudan has been at war for 8 years. It's killed nearly 400,000 people, displaced 4 million people. And then you have the coup in Sudan itself by the generals there. And you have Somalia, which has not really seen peace for 3 decades, and where 7.7 million people are drought threatened this year.
In Northern Africa, you identify a new pharaoh in Egypt. How would you characterize his leadership?
Well, General El-Sisi has been a very autocratic leader. He's muzzled the media. He's arrested thousands of people in Egypt. And basically, you haven't really seen any kind of freedom of speech or journalism in the Egyptian situation. So I'm actually quite concerned about the autocracy that we've seen. And he's also changed himself from a military ruler to a civilian leader, but he hasn't really allowed anybody to contest in a fair election, and it's winning over 90% of the vote.
And finally, Southern Africa, which a number of people have accused SADC, for instance, of not getting its house in order, especially where the movement of people is concerned. Your outlook for the year for Southern Africa?
Well, Southern Africa continues to be dominated by dominant party states. That was my analysis. And we have in Angola, for example, an election coming up in August. There's no doubt that the ruling MPLA is going to win that election. It's not really going to allow the opposition, UNITA or any other opposition, to really win. So it's going to win by means foul or fair. You also have repression, particularly in Zimbabwe and Eswatini. You've had protesters shot dead in Eswatini last year. I think about 70 of them, at least, according to civil society and human rights reports. And South Africa, which should be the hegemon and leader in this particular region, I think is going to be distracted by the ANC elective conference in December. And I think the president, Ramaphosa, has spent a lot more time on these intra-party squabbles than he has in actually trying to shape a vision for foreign policy, as we saw, for example, during the Thabo Mbeki era. So my outlook for this particular region, particularly with issues of climate change, which we often forget as well. The storm Anna killed about 80 people in Mozambique, Madagascar, and Malawi. And those weather systems are only getting worse, and they destroy infrastructure also, and schools and hospitals. So we mustn't also forget the effect of climate change, not just in Southern Africa, but drought in the Sahel and East Africa as well.
Professor Adebajo, there is a school of thought that says the events of 1884 continue to plague the continent, some overtly, some covertly. Talk us through the role of countries such as Russia, China and France on the continent, amongst many others.
Yes, well, 1884 to 85, there was an infamous conference that took place in Berlin under the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, which basically set the rules for carving up Africa into colonies. And the effects and impact of that conference are still with us today. The main external rivalry seems to be Russia using mercenaries to try to challenge France in its self-declared sphere of influence in the former French colonies. So you've seen, for example, Russia using the Wagner Group in the Central African Republic, and also challenging French influence in some of these recent countries that have had coups, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, like Guinea, and others as well. And that's the main dynamic. But the United States also has some kind of military presence deployed in about 20 African countries as part of its own anti-terrorist kind of policies within Africa. And it has drone bases also within West Africa in Niger, and also keeping an eye on Somalia as well. So there are external actors. China tends to have less of a military presence, but is the largest trading partner of Africa at $254 billion. And its influence is not only benign. You know, it's good that China is building infrastructure and trading with Africa, but if that trade is one-sided And if China somehow encourages or condones autocracy within the continent, that's also not a positive development.
Dr. Adebajo, surely there's some goodness that we can look forward to this year. There's too much at stake. I think something that comes to mind is the African Continental Free Trade Area Act. A lot being said about that. Is there any other silver lining?
Well, my silver lining, Dudu, is in the youth of Africa. 60% of the population of Africa is under 25. And a lot of these young people are doing amazing things in terms of technology, building companies, etc. But of course, you need governments to also create the enabling environment to allow that to flourish. That's really the silver lining and hope that I see. But I'm a bit skeptical of the African Continental Free Trade Area because in order for that to be successful, you need not just the sub-regions, institutions like ECOWAS and SADC and IGAD and the East African Community to be successful. You also need the countries to be successful, and they can't just be trading the same kinds of goods with each other. So we need to actually establish our manufacturing bases, not just dig up things out of the ground and export them abroad without adding value. We need a far more sophisticated vision for regional integration led by hegemonic powers, leaders on the continent that have stronger economies and larger economies like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, etc. And that's why I'm not so hopeful, because many of these leaders are themselves embroiled in domestic difficulties.